The sword was singing when Callahan walked through the palace gate, and that was the first thing she did wrong. She hadn't known it would do that. Back at the crash site, 3 days transit from the Vrathi home system, the blade had been quiet, half buried in scorched regolith, wrapped in what she'd taken for ceremonial cloth. She was a salvage medic attached to a diplomatic convoy, not an archivist. She'd logged it as cultural artifact, category unknown, and when no one came to claim the wreckage, she'd brought it along, because someone, somewhere, was clearly missing it. That had seemed like enough reason. The Vrathi gate was tall enough for 2 of her stacked, carved from something that looked like bone but breathed faintly when the wind moved through it. The 2 guards flanking the arch were tall too. Their scaled skin the deep blue-green of deep water, their eyes the amber of something much older. They had seen the sword before Callahan reached the gate. She knew because they went very, very still. The singing started low, a resonance, really, more felt in the sternum than heard and climbed as she passed through the arch. By the time she reached the inner courtyard, it was a clear, sustained tone that seemed to be coming from inside her own chest. The courtyard stopped. There were perhaps 60 Vrathi in various states of motion, crossing flagstones, carrying things, speaking in small groups, and every one of them stopped, turned, found the sound with their amber eyes, and then found Callahan at the center of it. And the expression that moved through the crowd was not one she could read yet. She held up her free hand. "Hello. I'm looking for whoever handles lost property." The scholar's name was Venn, and he had spent 11 years studying human behavioral anomalies for the Royal Institute of Interspecies Cognition, and he was quite certain he had never seen anything like this. He watched from the upper gallery as the human stood in the center of 60 frozen courtiers, sword in hand, expression open and genuinely puzzled, and said something about lost property. The sword was the Times Ithacai, the Queen's soul blade, bound to Savith at her coronation, in a ceremony that took 3 days and left her unable to fully sleep for a month. It had been lost 11 years ago when her personal transport was ambushed in the outer system, ambushed, most believed, by the Dithavi faction, though nothing had been proven. The Queen had not been on the transport. 3 of her guard had been. The Times Ithacai Times was not lost property. The Times Ithacai Times was, depending on which legal framework you applied, either a declaration of conquest, if the human had taken it by force, an intolerable insult, if she had found it and kept it, or there was no third category. Veen had checked 3 times. He made his way down to the courtyard at something faster than his usual pace. The human was still standing in the same spot when he reached her. She had not, he noted, put the sword down. Several guards had their hands on their weapons. The human either hadn't noticed this or had decided it wasn't her most pressing concern. She seemed to be examining one of the flagstone carvings with genuine interest. "You are the human from the diplomatic convoy," Veen said. She looked up. "Callahan, ship medic, technically, but I do salvage on the side." She glanced at the sword, then at him. "Is this yours?" "Someone's?" "It was at the crash site in Sector 7. I tried the standard artifact protocols, but nothing came back." "It is not mine," Veen said carefully. "It belongs to the Queen." Something moved across her face, relief, mostly. "Oh, good. I've been worried about it. The wrapping was damaged, and I wasn't sure I'd stored it correctly. Is she here? I'd like to make sure it's okay." Veen looked at this human. This small, warm-blooded creature, holding a piece of his queen's soul, and asking if it was okay, and felt something his training had not prepared him for. "She is here," he said. "Great," Callahan smiled, and it was the uncomplicated smile of someone who had accomplished a reasonable task. "Lead the way." Queen Savith was in the Hall of Address when they brought her the news, and she was in the middle of a trade negotiation that she immediately stopped caring about. She had not felt the Times Ithacai Times in 11 years. The absence of it was something she had learned to carry. The way one learned to carry a missing limb, not forgotten, just redistributed. The weight of it shifted to other parts of her. She had learned to sleep in pieces. She had learned to make decisions through the gap, where certainty used to live. And now it was singing. She could feel it through the soles of her feet, through the floor, through the entire palace, which was built on the old resonance stone that the HFY had always been attuned to. The song was different than she remembered. Warmer. As if the blade had been somewhere it hadn't expected to be warm and had adjusted. She left the trade negotiators without a word. The human was standing in the courtyard with Van, who was doing his careful scholar expression. And the HFY Times was at her side, as naturally as if it had always been there, the cloth wrapping slightly damaged and repaired with what appeared to be medical tape. Savith walked until she was close enough to see the human's face. Brown skin, short dark hair, a scar across one jaw that hadn't been healed cleanly, a salvage scar, something incurred in a tight space. Her eyes were the color of rain on stone, and they were looking at Savith with the same open expression she'd apparently used on the entire courtyard. Not afraid. Not performing lack of fear. Simply present. The HFY sang a note that Savith had not heard in 11 years. A recognition note. A greeting. "You are alive," Savith said. She had meant to say something else. That was what came out. The human Callahan tilted her head. Was that in question? Savith looked at Veen. Veen cleared his throat. "I haven't explained the full context yet, Majesty." "No," Savith said. "I imagine you haven't." Nobody had told Callahan that the sword remembered everyone who touched it, and that it had never been warm before. Veen explained this the following morning, in a small room off the main corridor, over a beverage the Vrathi called Times Sithara. Times that tasted like pine needles and chamomile, and something she couldn't name but found oddly comforting. He was meticulous in his explanation. He used charts. He had clearly prepared. The Times HFY, he told her, was not a sword in the way humans understood swords. It was a soul anchor bound to the Queen's life force in the bonding ceremony, tuned to her specifically, designed to resonate in her presence and fall silent everywhere else. It maintained no warmth. It remembered no touch. When Vrathi scholars had studied similar artifacts, they had found them essentially inert when separated from their bound person, like a compass with no north. "So what you're telling me," Callahan said, "is that it was warm. When we examined it after you arrived," Veen said carefully, "there was residual thermal signature in the hilt." Callahan turned her cup in her hands. "I held it a lot. The first week. I was worried about it." She paused. "Is that a problem?" Veen looked at his charts. "It is unprecedented," he said. Which was not an answer. What he did not tell her yet, because he was still working out how to explain it without causing a diplomatic incident, was the legal situation. Under Vrathi law, the HFY could only be returned in one of two ways. The first, the holder had conquered the Queen and was offering the sword as a trophy of dominance, which triggered the ritual of subjugation. The second, the holder had found it and kept it knowingly, which was an insult to the royal line, and triggered something considerably more severe. There was no provision for a human salvage medic who had found it in a crash site, worried about its storage conditions, repaired the wrapping with medical tape, and carried it across 3 systems because it seemed like the right thing to do. The ritual of reclamation, the formal mechanism for returning the HFY, required the holder to kneel before the court and speak the confession of unworthiness. Callahan would need to do this before midday. He explained all of this. She listened carefully. "I'm willing to kneel," she said. "That part's fine. But what am I confessing to being unworthy of? I want to make sure I understand what I'm agreeing to." Veen blinked. "The HFY. Right, but unworthy how? Unworthy as in, I'm not royal? I'm not Vrathi? I'm not the right species? I didn't ask for it. I just found it." So I'm not sure what failing I'm acknowledging. She was not being difficult. He could see that. She was genuinely trying to parse the logic. It seems dishonest to confess to something I'm not sure I did. This was, Vian thought, the most human thing he had yet encountered. Not the bravery of bringing the sword here. Not the warmth the blade had somehow absorbed. The fact that she would not agree to something she didn't understand. He excused himself to consult with 3 different legal scholars and came back 2 hours later with what he privately considered a deeply inadequate answer. She was still in the room. She had found a piece of equipment from her medic kit and was repairing something small and fiddly with the focused attention of someone who did not find silence uncomfortable. The confession acknowledges that you hold something beyond your station, he said. She looked up. Okay. That I understand. She set down the equipment. Can I ask something first? The sword, the times I the Kai times it was warm because I held it. Does that mean something? To her? Veen sat down. This was outside the charts. I don't know, he admitted. We have no precedent. Callahan nodded slowly. She lost it 11 years ago. Yes. And she didn't, no one found it before me. The faction that attacked the transport hid it. We believe they planned to use it eventually, as leverage. They were disrupted before they could. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the palace made its low sounds footsteps, the distant chime of a time bell, the particular resonance of the resonant stone walls that Callahan had commented on the first morning, saying it felt like the building was humming to itself. Okay, she said. I'll do the confession. You understand what you're agreeing to. Not entirely, but I understand enough. They went to the hall at the 3rd bell, and Callahan knelt on the Vrathi flagstones with her knees on carved stone and said the words Vane had taught her, slowly and carefully, in the Vrathi tongue. Around them, the court watched in the particular silence of people witnessing something they were not sure how to classify. And then the Times Ithkai Times sang. Not the recognition note it had given when the Queen walked in. A different note. Something Veen had no word for. He would spend the next several months looking for one low and complex and oddly tender. The Queen's hand, resting on the hilt, was very still. The sword had been lost for 11 years, and the Queen had not slept well in 11 years. And Callahan was starting to put that together. She'd had 3 days in the palace now. Long enough to learn that the Vrathi didn't drink hot liquids the times Sethara times Vian had given her was apparently the exception, kept specifically for off-world visitors, and that the particular smell of the palace corridors in the morning was from the resonance stone, which apparently released something aromatic as it warmed, and that Veen found human curiosity equal parts fascinating and exhausting, which she respected as an honest response. She'd also noticed that the Queen moved like someone who was permanently braced for something. Not fear, nothing in Savith's bearing suggested fear, but the specific readiness of a person who had learned, through long experience, that good things ended. She'd seen it in field medics after long deployments. She'd seen it in herself. Once, after a bad salvage run. She was thinking about this, seated on a low bench in the corridor outside the diplomatic suite, when the attack happened. It was not subtle. The Dathavi faction had apparently decided that the disruption of the reclamation ritual, the anomaly, the unprecedented warmth in the times Ithakai, the legal gray area of Callahan's status, created an opportunity. 3 of them came through the East Wing, fast and coordinated, during the brief window when the Queen's Guard had been redistributed to accommodate the diplomatic convoy's security protocols. Callahan heard the sound before she understood what it was. Boots on stone. Multiple sets. Wrong rhythm. The rhythm of people moving fast and trying not to sound like it. Then Veen appeared around the corner at something approaching a run, which she had not seen him do before. And there was a short blade in his hand, which she also had not seen before. And behind him there were 3 figures in gray, who were clearly not there for a diplomatic meeting. She was on her feet before she decided to stand up. The HFY Times was in her hand. She had been carrying it since the reclamation ritual. At the Queen's quiet instruction, apparently the blade had not wanted to leave her grip during the ceremony, which had created a further unprecedented legal question that no one had resolved yet. It felt different in her hand now than it had in the first days. Lighter, somehow. Or maybe she'd just gotten used to it. What happened next took less than 30 seconds and left her with a cut across her left forearm and 2 of the 3 attackers on the ground. Which was more than she'd expected. She wasn't a warrior. She'd done 2 semesters of mandatory close defense training and spent most of her career trying to help injured people instead of creating them. But she'd put herself between Veen and the nearest blade on instinct, and then there had been the specific physics of very close quarters, and she had a strong, stubborn streak and a salvage medic's intimate familiarity with leverage. The 3rd attacker stopped when Scifi appeared. The Queen had come from the far corridor. She moved in total silence and arrived like a fact, not an event. She looked at Callahan. She looked at the HFY Times in Callahan's hand. She looked at the 2 people on the floor and the one who had gone very still. Callahan extended the sword hilt first towards Scifi. Not because someone told her to. Not because it was legally required. Simply because Scifi was there, and the sword was hers, and it had always felt like it was borrowed. The Queen took it. The sound that came from the HFY Times, resonating through the floor, through the walls, through the resonant stone that the whole palace was built on, was not like the other notes. It was full. Complete. Like a sentence that had been 11 years, mid-syllable, finally reaching its period. The 3rd attacker, in the ringing silence that followed, put his weapon on the floor. Veen was bleeding from a cut on his shoulder that Callahan was already categorizing as non-critical but unpleasant. She turned to him with the automatic focus of her actual job, pulling a kit from her belt. "That was very fast," he said. His voice was somewhat unsteady. "Adrenaline," she said, pressing a seal bandage to the cut. "Hold that." He held it. He was staring at her arm. "You're injured." "I know. Yours first." She applied pressure, watching his face for signs of shock. His amber eyes were doing something complicated. "You okay?" "You stepped in front of me," he said. "Yeah. You didn't. We've known each other for 3 days." Callahan looked up at him. 4, counting the day I arrived. "And you've been decent to me. Decent matters." She secured the bandage. "There. Okay. Now mine." She sat down on the floor, which seemed like the most practical place to be, and started treating her own arm with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this before in worse places. Around her, the palace guards who had arrived approximately 30 seconds too late were securing the corridor and communicating in rapid Vrathi that she couldn't follow yet. Scifi stood in the center of the corridor, the HFY Times in her hand, and said nothing for a long moment. Veen, who had been watching the Queen the way scholars watched rare phenomena, said quietly, "I've never seen her look like that." Callahan glanced up from her arm. Scifi was looking at her. It was hard to read. Vrathi expressions, still the scale patterns shifted in ways she hadn't learned to map yet. But there was something in it, something that had not been there on the first day. She went back to her arm. The floor was cool against her legs, and the Sithara Times she'd been bringing back to her room was spilled somewhere in the corridor, which was a shame because she'd been getting to like it. The wound was clean, at least. Healers would probably want to redo her work, but she'd done all right in the meantime. She was alive. Veen was alive. The HFY Times was where it belonged. All things considered, it had been a reasonable day. They gave Callahan a room with a window and a healer who smelled like rain, and she spent most of the night trying to explain to Veen why she'd done it. The healer, a young Vrathi named Ase, who had the particular patience of someone accustomed to patients who complicated their own injuries, had spent an hour improving on Callahan's fieldwork, and then left with the mild disapproval of someone who felt that the whole situation could have been avoided if certain people would simply not put themselves in front of blades. Veen had stayed. He sat in the room's second chair with his shoulder properly dressed and the expression of someone working through a significant recalibration. Outside the window, the palace's night lighting made the resonant stone walls glow faintly amber. The whole building hummed at the frequency Callahan was starting to think of as the sound of something very old being cared for. "The faction," she said. "They're finished?" "The Queen has been looking for evidence to act on for a long time," Veen said. "Tonight provided it." "Yes. Finished." Callahan let out a breath. "Good." He was quiet for a moment. The room had a smell she liked, something sharp and clean, like the air just before rain. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you bring it back?" She frowned. "The sword?" "Yes." He had his careful scholar face on, but underneath it there was something genuine. You could have left it logged as an unidentified artifact. You could have turned it over to the diplomatic mission's artifact office. You could have sold it. I looked up the relevant statutes. Under human salvage law, you would have had legal claim. You could have kept it. He paused. "Why didn't you? Why didn't you?" She thought about it. She thought about the crash site, the scorched regolith, the cloth wrapping that had been red and gold once, but was gray now, with heat and time. She thought about the first night, when she'd taken the sword out of the compartment and turned it over in her hands and felt the weight of something that had clearly once been loved. Someone was missing it, she said. That was obvious. You could tell the cloth, the way it was wrapped. Someone had put care into that, and then it had been gone a long time. I don't know. I don't like the feeling of things being missing that should be found. She looked at her bandaged arm. Seemed like I could do something about it. Seemed like. Veen was quiet for a long moment. Just that. Just that. He looked at his hands. In our legal tradition, he said slowly, there is no precedent for what you did. Returning the times, HFY times alive, not as conquest, not as insult, just as return. There is no category. We have been arguing about what it means since you arrived. He paused. I believe the argument has concluded. What did they decide? Gratitude, he said, as if the word were slightly foreign in his mouth. They decided it means gratitude is owed. Callahan looked at him. That shouldn't be that complicated. For us, it is. We are the Vrathi, are a proud people. Gratitude implies a debt. Debt implies a power imbalance. The law does not have smooth language for receiving something freely given. Huh. She shifted in the bed, careful of her arm. Outside, something in the palace chimed a time bell. The sound rolling through the resonant stone and arriving slightly warmer than it started. You could borrow some of ours. Human word for it is just, thank you. We say it all the time, even when we mean a lot more than 2 words. She heard footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, deliberate, the particular footfall of someone who chose every step consciously. Then, a knock at the door, which was unexpected. The Queen, Vane had explained, did not knock, but it was Savith who opened the door. She had left her formal regalia somewhere. She was wearing Callahan, didn't know the Vrathi word for it, but the equivalent of something comfortable, layered in deep greens and browns. She was carrying a small vessel, the kind Ase had left filled with water, and she had filled it with something else. The smell reached Callahan first, pine needles and chamomile, and the unnamed thing. Sethera. The Queen sat down in the chair. Veen had quietly vacated. She set the vessel on the small table, near the bed. She looked at Callahan for a long moment in which the palace hummed, and the amber light played across the resonant stone walls, and the times, HFY times, sheathed now. At Savith's side, made no sound at all. You held it for 2 months, Savith said. It was warm. I didn't know what it was, Callahan said. I just knew it was important to someone. For 11 years I could not feel where it was. If it was intact, safe. Something moved in her expression, slow and deep as a tide. When you walked through the gate, the whole palace sang. I felt it in my feet before anyone came to tell me. Callahan didn't say anything. Sometimes you didn't need to. I'm told, Savith said, that humans have a very simple word for what I owe you. You don't owe me anything. My scholars disagree. Your scholars can disagree. Callahan reached for the vessel with her uninjured arm and poured 2 cups, because that was what you did, and extended one toward the queen. I found something that belonged to you and I brought it back. You'd have done the same. Savith considered the cup. The Vrathi, Callahan now knew, didn't drink hot liquids as a rule. The Times Sethera Times was not technically hot, lukewarm, barely, the way she'd been served it the first morning. But the queen looked at the cup for a moment longer than necessary, the way someone looked at something unfamiliar that they were considering trusting. Then she took it. Thank you, said the queen of the Vrathi, in the human tongue, in the voice of someone who meant considerably more than 2 words. Callahan raised her own cup. The Times Sethera Times tasted the same as it always had, pine needles and chamomile, and the thing she couldn't name, and outside the window, the palace glowed in its ancient amber light, and everything hummed. And the sword was home. And the queen of the Vrathi sat in a small warm room in the middle of the night and drank something she had never tried before. And across the diplomatic halls, the faction's evidence was being catalogued. And in 3 months, there would be a new treaty, and in 5 years, Callahan would be back for a conference, and Veen would have written 4 papers about events that began with a sword singing at a gate. But none of that was now. Now was the cup, and the light, and the low sound of something enormous and old finally at rest.